Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on and conclude, in fact, the casual conversations and discussions with regard to those films that are included and contained in this very iconic horror film series known as Friday the 13th. And today in particular, if you don't mind, I would like to talk about this film from 2009, Marcus Nispel. This is the remake, or the reboot, Friday the 13th. Now, before we go any further, let me say that this is not in any way meant to be any kind of comprehensive review of the film. This is merely an opportunity for me to share some thoughts and comments I have about my experiences with the film. And also there will be plot specific points brought up along the way, so just in case for your information. This is a very interesting film in the context of the entirety of the Friday the 13th series for a number of reasons, I think. First of all, we have to address the very fundamental point about this film, which is that it is a remake or a reboot or a reimagining or a retelling or a reworking or a reestablishing of the particulars of the early part of the Friday the 13th series. Specifically, it addresses points that we saw established in films like Friday the 13th, Friday the 13th Part 2, Friday the 13th Part 3, and arguably Friday the 13th, the final chapter. So in essence, and of course there are other linkages I think that exist with other Friday the 13th films in the series, but I think for the most part, fundamentally speaking, from a plot perspective anyway, what we are dealing with this 2009 version is in essence a film that is seeking to rework or retell those moments that we saw in those early core films, the first 4 films in this horror film series. So that, I think, presents almost immediately a number of possibilities and also a number of outcomes as far as how a viewer will react to this particular film. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that this is, in those terms, a reboot or a remake. Also, it is a film that does emerge in the late 2000s, and because it emerges in this particular period of time, it is very much a part of, or it otherwise exhibits, certain aspects of visual storytelling, type of visual aesthetic, if you will, and also cinema horror aesthetics and cinema grammar that I think is very much part and parcel, or very much part of, integral to, the overall cinema landscape, or to be more specific, the overall popular horror cinema landscape of the mid to late 2000s and beyond to the present day. Right? Because after all, speaking outside of the horror genre for a moment, I think it can be said that the certain filmmaking aesthetic and style that became very much part of the convention or normal with, say, popular mainstream films that were made in, say, the 2000s, have a certain look that could be said to be distinct from, say, films that were made in the 1980s or the 1990s, if you will. So there is always a sense of films being part of the particular era in which they are made. So that's definitely true for 80s films. That's definitely true for 90s films. That's definitely true for the early 2000s films. And that is, of course, where this film falls. So we see a certain set of aesthetics applied. And these set of aesthetics can be made even more pronounced and more visible. But when we remember, too, that this film, Friday the 13th, the 2009 version, if we recall, did emerge from this period of filmmaking of popular horror films where filmmakers like Platinum Dunes, for example, and others were making these films that seemed to be relying on specific aspects of editing and visual style, and in terms of story, there were also examples of where films were being remade. For example, Texas Chainsaw Massacre films were emerging during the 2000s, as we know. Also, there would be the Nightmare on Elm Street remake and other films of a similar vein. And Friday the 13th, the 2009 version, definitely falls in that landscape. So already we are dealing not just with a remake, not just with a reboot, but also a horror film from the late 2000s. And so with these elements, I think there is much room for debate and discussion among, say, Friday the 13th fans as to how this film fits into the overall category or series that is Friday the 13th, right? Because after all, Friday the 13th, up to, say, a certain recent point of the films anyway, did rely on its sense of continuity. It was the same character, more or less, that we saw from the first film carried on through the films, or say the second film onwards. And then there were certain plot machinations along the way, granted, but still there was a sense of continuity. And of course, there might have been some blurring of the lines, some possibility for somewhat alterations in terms of continuity, especially when we got into territory like Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, or Jason X, for example, or even Freddy versus Jason. But still, even so, my point is, up to a certain point, there was a sense of a type of continuity, which might be said to be still intact or maybe somewhat distinct and separate when we get to these later films. So with all that said, I think we're dealing with a film that arguably, right, stands distinct for a lot of reasons from the rest of the Friday the 13th films. So already we have a lot of discussion points. And for you, my dear friends, for those of you who are fans of the Friday the 13th series, you, of course, may or may not like this film as a Friday the 13th film or as a horror film. It's really up to you. After all, you are the ultimate decision maker as far as what films you like and don't like. And that's true for Friday the 13th, the 2009 version. That's also true for any film, of course, right? This is a kind of obvious point. You know, you are the ultimate decision maker as to what you like and you don't like. So I can totally understand if for those reasons or maybe other reasons you may be a fan of Friday the 13th, but maybe you don't like this film, or you don't like the way that the film seems to be going as far as a remake or reboot is concerned. I can totally understand those criticisms, and if you feel that way, that is completely valid from my point of view and very reasonable. Then I should say, from my own personal vantage point, that when I first saw this film, I was maybe cautiously anticipating what would come. I mean, after all, I should say that for me personally, I am not inherently or automatically against the concept of remakes. Sometimes a remake can be bad, sometimes it can be mediocre, but sometimes a remake can be good or really, really good. And it really depends on the situation and circumstance and the filmmakers involved and the concept and the conceit, etc. And I understand it's actually quite a complicated situation in terms of the remake and the remake's relationship with the earlier film or earlier films, and how that relationship exists concurrently as one is watching the new film versus the old film. So there are a lot of interesting sort of permutations when it comes to not just the remake, but the remake's relationship with the past film, etc. And I totally get that, and I think that's a very legitimate approach to remakes. This is my way of saying, in a roundabout way, that I am not inherently and automatically against remakes. I think it's actually another interesting field of cinematic exploration and consideration that is well worth considering. So with that perspective, I was looking forward to this film on the one hand, and also I was maybe cautiously optimistic because, of course, as we know, a remake can be good or a remake could possibly be pretty bad. And so there was always that risk in the air. Okay, so that was my approach going in. When I finally saw the film, I must say that I felt like it was a film that maybe didn't necessarily, for me, reach the great and glorious heights of, say, the first 4 films or the first 5 films in the Friday the 13th series. As I've said before, those films are for me the core films, and I find those to be classic examples of the genre. And I look at those maybe with a sense of nostalgia, but also with a sense of admiration, because I am a fan of those films. So perhaps when I saw this film, my reaction was that it probably doesn't reach the same heights as those films. That being said, I can still say that I was and continue to be quite entertained by this particular remake or reboot, which is Friday the 13th from 2009, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, I find that the plot structure of this particular remake or reboot to be very fascinating indeed. Now, we have to remember that this film is not just a remake of Part 1. It's not just a remake of Part 2, but it's also a remake of Part 3 and Part 4. In other words, it seems to be trying to tackle plot elements from the first film, and then the second film, and then the third and fourth film, in this very interesting plot structure that the remake presents. So what do I mean by this? Of course, right? Phase 1 of the film deals with, in the opening moments, those very climactic elements that we saw, say, at the end of the first film in terms of what happens to Mrs. Voorhees. Then the second phase occurs a little bit later, but it's the second phase of this film, and it's maybe occupies probably the first third, perhaps, of the film's overall running time. And this covers an aspect which is the emergence of Jason Voorhees, the look of Jason Voorhees with the hooded mask, which is, of course, the look that reminds us of Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2. And also there is the element of the camping in the wooded area and the lake and the nighttime, and also another plot element which we will understand later to be something about how a character, the Whitney character, reminds Jason of his mother, Mrs. Voorhees, which we know is also a plot point that we've seen in Part 2, remember, with Amy Steele's character and the sweater. And so this second phase of this remake deals with the Part 2 elements. It's retelling it or reworking it, but still, it is, I think, very closely related to Part 2 for those reasons. Then the film suddenly switches gears after we get this set of characters, and then abruptly find out, there's an abrupt change, and then we are left wondering what has happened to the final character in this phase 2, which is the Whitney character. We will, of course, find out what happens to her later, but there's a sudden and abrupt changeover to what we understand to be some time has passed later. And then we now have phase 3 of Friday the 13th, the remake, which is yet another set of characters. And this time it's the set of characters, Jenna and Trent and their friends like Chewie and everyone, and they're going to the lakeside house. This is Trent's family's lakeside house, we understand. And so this then is the setup for the further chaos and carnage that will ensue with the emergence of Jason in this phase 3 component. So we already have this lakeside house setup, which, if we recall, is very similar to the way that the characters reach the lake or the lake area in Part 3. And also in Part 4, the final chapter. So there is always this house. It's not a camp per se, but it's a house, much like this Phase 3 element in the remake. Also, in the Phase 3 element, we get the introduction of the hockey mask Jason. And of course, as we know, the hockey mask Jason first emerged around the midpoint or so in Friday the 13th Part 3. And so these and other elements make this Phase 3 of the remake tie closely together with, I would argue, Part 3 and Part 4 of the series. So just to take a step back, we have Phase 1, which is relating to Part 1, Phase 2, which is relating to Part 2, and then Phase 3, which is relating to Parts 3 and 4. And this is all encompassed in this remake, Friday the 13th. I find that to be very fascinating indeed. Now, I can probably see, or I can probably identify a practical reason for the filmmakers wanting to do this, right? Because after all, when we think back on the broad spectrum of Friday the 13th, we understand that probably the most indelible, iconic image to emerge from this series of films is Jason, and specifically the hockey mask Jason. Right, that's of course not taking anything away from my admiration and love for, say, Friday the 13th and Friday the 13th Part 2. Of course, I think those films are fantastic. I've talked about them before. But I'm talking about from a broad perspective, let's say on a sort of on a maybe global level. What do people think of when they think of Friday the 13th? They think of Jason in the hockey mask. That is probably the most indelible image. And so with that, any Friday the 13th remake would probably want to or be interested in trying to get at that Jason aspect as soon as possible. And so it's really interesting how the filmmakers decided to do that for the remake, right? I mean, I think conceptually they could have very easily just, say, ignored all these plot points that we know were firmly established in parts 1 and 2. They could have just gone right for a story that involved the hockey mask immediately, and the Jason story emerging from there, skipping over the hood, you know. But they didn't. And in fact, they tried to go with this phased approach, as I say, linking with each of the films along the way. And I find that to be really interesting. I mean, there's something to be said about a remake maybe. Sometimes a bad remake is bad because it doesn't pay enough respect to the original source material, or it strays too far from the original source material. And perhaps for some, this film, the remake, Friday the 13th, does just that. Again, it depends on your point of view and your perspective. But one can also say that because of this plot structure that the remake employs, one can say that it's this plot structure alone that is one of the reasons why one can see the remake as being very faithful to the original subject matter of the films, of the original films, even though it is still at the same time doing its own thing, or trying to do its own thing, and trying to do its own retelling or reworking. So I find that dynamic as a storytelling technique in a remake fashion to be very fascinating indeed. Another thing that is really interesting about this plot structure, in my view, is it is, on the one hand, a structure that is tied to the past films in a way that one might expect certain things to occur. In other words, this is very much like Part 2, and so because it's very much like Part 2, then there should be elements that would emerge in terms of a plot or character perspective that would be similar to Plot 2, or to Part 2, and thus I, as a viewer who maybe know the earlier films, might not necessarily be surprised because I can expect what's coming, right? So that's, I think, the general expectation that is being set up. However, it can be argued, I think, rather effectively that this film goes against certain expectations of the genre to the point that it can reach points of quite genuine surprise when watching the film for the first time. And as I say, those surprises, I think, come because of a certain reliance on what we have seen in past films, in past Friday the 13th films. Here's an example. At the end of the Phase 2 element of Friday the 13th, the remake, if you recall, Whitney, the young woman, she's about to be attacked by Jason, and then suddenly it cuts abruptly. And then we're left wondering what exactly happened to her, because we don't see on screen the aftermath of this apparent attack from Jason Voorhees. But the reasonable assumption is that maybe she too fell victim, and it just the film cut away before it could show any more. And so that's what we're left wondering. And I think that expectation is quite reasonable, and it's in fact the expectation that I held when I first saw the film. But, oh no, we realize when we get into the third component of the film, the Clay, Jenna story, and Trent and the house, when we get into this third component of the film, we realize somewhat into this component that, oh no, Whitney indeed survived. not only did she survive, she is being held captive by Jason because, according to Jason, she has a very close resemblance to Mrs. Voorhees. So that, I think, is a very interesting twist. I mean, it's an interesting twist because I wasn't necessarily expecting it on the one hand, but it is also an interesting twist because it's twisting the plot into a particular trait that is in itself connected to the earlier films. Because remember, the resemblance to Mrs. Voorhees, that element was a very key component of the climax of part 2 with the sweater, the scene at the end of that film. So in an interesting way, it is twisting the narrative to the point where it's coming back to something that is from the original. So I find that kind of a very interesting plot circuitous route to be something that I find very entertaining, and I was very pleasantly surprised by that kind of aspect. Another aspect, too, is in terms of the way that this film seems to generate a sense of surprise, is there are ways that the film goes against what otherwise might be genre conventions or expectations. So, for example, the idea of what is known as the final survivor of the film. It's usually a young female character, if we recall the earlier Friday the 13th films. And in fact, we have a number of characters, especially in the third phase of this film, that could be candidates for the final survivor character. And I think Jenna, the character of Jenna, comes to mind as well. But surprisingly, what happens to Jenna is almost toward the end of the film, she suddenly falls victim to Jason Voorhees in this underground tunnel situation in a very shocking and abrupt way, such that the final remaining survivors become Clay and Whitney. And so what we have is that kind of final survivor being the sole surviving young woman that is essentially abandoned in favor of the brother-sister combination. And the sister, of course, being the character that we saw from the second phase of the film, but she isn't, arguably speaking, she's not the main character of this third and primary component of the film. So we're talking about essentially a secondary character, which is Whitney, and then one of the primary characters being Clay. But Clay as a primary character is not a young female character, but a young male character. So I think that is an interesting way that this seems to upshift certain genre expectations that one would otherwise maybe expect based on viewings of past Friday the 13th films. So I appreciate this remake for trying to maneuver itself into ways that I recognize as being attempts at trying, at one hand, relying on past subject matter, but also trying to work with it in a way that will still shock and surprise even the most experienced of Friday the 13th fans. And while I wouldn't call myself the most expert when it comes to Friday the 13th, not at all, I am far from being an expert in these films, still, I have seen the films prior to watching the remake, and still I felt very surprised along the way. And so I admired that about the remake and what it was trying to do. Also, places that I admire very much are, for example, the Jason Voorhees character and portrayal, the Derek Mears portrayal, and the look and the makeup. I like this because this is another one of these situations where it calls back, I think, quite faithfully to aspects of Jason Voorhees' character in the past, while still seemingly forging its own path and its own unique perspective. So, for example, certain aspects of the makeup, the emergence of, say, hair and the emergence of certain physical traits seems to be an attempt to be very faithful to the look of Jason that we saw unmasked in films like, say, Friday the 13th Part 2 or Friday the 13th The Final Chapter even. So I really appreciate those, what I see as being attempts at trying to be faithful in those regards. At the same time, this film is also trying to make its own stamp of identity. And I think it does that by showing us a Jason that seems to have a certain sense of dexterity and agility. Of course, we saw, I would say, a Jason of dexterity and agility to a certain degree in films like Part 2 and Part 3 and Part 4 even. But still, when we recall other portrayals of Jason, which I think were all great, still there is this sense of a kind of a movement to Jason's physicality in this film that could be said to be reminiscent, but also could be said to be its own thing. And I really admire that very much. Also, there's this idea of augmenting or highlighting the aspect of Jason's character that is like maybe a tactical survivalist hunter, in terms of the application of certain tools and that sort of thing. So, and the underground caverns and this kind of thing. So I find this aspect also to be very much an interesting way to try to portray Jason Voorhees in this manner. So I like this very much. And that's not to say I dislike any of the other portrayals. I don't. I think they're all great in their own way. And also I think this portrayal too is really great in its own way. So I admire this aspect as well. So with those reasons, as I say, and I'll go back to my earlier comments to try to wrap up this conversation, I found this remake to be very entertaining on its own merits. And even now, when I rewatch it and rewatch it and rewatch it again, I still find it entertaining for those reasons. Is it a perfect Friday the 13th film for me, or is it my favorite Friday the 13th film? As I say, it probably doesn't reach those same heights of excellence that I would suggest are in the earlier Friday the 13th films for me. So it would be no. My answer to that would be no to that question. But still, I find it to be, for those reasons that I was suggesting earlier, a fun time, and it's one that I can see a number of positive elements about. Now, this is, of course, as of now, this video, the last and most recent Friday the 13th film. And ever since this period, we haven't seen any feature film Friday the 13th in the theater or otherwise. And so, is this the end for now? Well, hopefully there will be more Friday the 13th films. Who knows? And if that day emerges, will that be a continuation of this continuity, or will it be maybe a whole new continuity, or will it be another reworking that is connected to a past continuity? Who knows? I think the possibilities are actually quite voluminous. And so that, I think, is very exciting. So it's just a matter of keeping one's fingers crossed, I suppose, especially if one is a Friday the 13th fan, and hoping that maybe one day we might see a new Friday the 13th film, in whatever form it might be. Now, just to conclude all of these videos as a whole, I should say that this is an example of where Friday the 13th might be said to be somewhat distinct. We are dealing with a retelling, which could be said to be trying to establish its own continuity. So in that way, it might be said to be very different from what came previous. But at the same time, my friends, that's one of the strengths, I think, of the Friday the 13th films, especially from Part 6 onwards. After all, we did see from Part 6 onwards, as I was trying to suggest, a different form of Friday the 13th film. Part 6 being like a horror action comedy film, and also a really visceral, thrilling, and quite suspenseful film as well. And then Part 7, the Tina character, the Carrie telekinesis aspect. And then Part 8, the boat and New York. And then and Jason Goes to Hell, the Final Friday, the reimagining of the mythology and the family lineage, and also the emergence of the reference to Freddy Krueger, and then Jason X, which is Jason in space, and then Freddy versus Jason, which is the first crossover, right? And then here, which is the remake, which is in itself, I think, an interesting a twist on the concept of the remake. And so we're getting very different modes of Friday the 13th action and cinematic expression in each of these films. Plus, we have Part 5, which is in itself, I think, a very unique and particular and peculiar Friday the 13th experience in a lot of ways. And as I say, I admire that film tremendously. Plus, we have the core films. And each of those, while they might seem to be similar, each has its own mode and form of existence, as it were. And it goes all the way back to the first film, which is, as we know, one of these great beautifully established paradoxes in cinema history, I would argue, because it all revolves around a story that built around Friday the 13th, that is about Jason and the hockey mask Jason, etc. But the actual film itself, as we know, is not about that. It's about something arguably quite different. And so there is this wonderful paradox that exists with this film and the series as a whole. And I think that the remake sits in the series so comfortably in those terms. And I find it, therefore, to be a really good entry in this particular series of films, Friday the 13th. Again, is it my favorite? Probably not. And I also acknowledge that maybe there are people who might not like it. But that's okay. That's okay, because even if you don't like this film, there are always the other films that you can fall back on and watch and rewatch and enjoy. And you can choose to watch those in any way that you like. So that's to say that I think there's a lot to offer, a lot that is being offered in the series of films, and that is one of the reasons why I admire it very much. So this is the end of the discussion, unless there is a new Friday the 13th film that emerges. But until then, my friends, thank you so much for your time, your enthusiasm. Thank you for sharing with me along the way your comments about the films. You are so into them. You've shown me your expertise. You have corrected me where I needed correcting, and so thank you so much for that. That has been that's a good example of where you, my dear friends, are so important, not just for this channel, but also for my own personal learning and cinema journey. So thank you so much for joining me along this discussion of these Friday the 13th films. I certainly enjoyed myself, and I have you, my dear friends, to thank for that. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So with that, my friends, thank you. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I really appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.